Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Basel Conversations. I'm excited to introduce you to the next panel, which is titled Global or Local for Whom, with the amazing speakers Fernanda Brenner, Artistic Director of Pivô in Sao Paulo, Mary Spirito, Founding Director Protocinema in Istanbul and New York, and Dana Whabira, founder of Njelele Art Station in Harare. And it's going to be moderated by Alessio Antoniolli, Director of Gasworks and Triangle Network in London. Enjoy.
Hello. Oh, yes. Hi, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the kind invitation. I will start the talk by elaborating a little bit more about what my colleagues on the panel do, because I think it's really important, particularly with a topic such as the global and the local, to sort of have an understanding and a grounding from which we speak. So, well, first I'll introduce myself a bit more. I'm the director, as Anneli was saying, of Gasworks and the Triangle Network. Gasworks, for those of you that don't know, it's a studio, residency and exhibition space in London. We work with UK and international artists, mostly emerging artists. We commission their first body of work or we support them in their research. I'm also the director of the Triangle Network, and I'm delighted to be sitting next to two members of the network, and we can also talk a little bit more about that. And the Triangle Network started in the early 80s, so it's something that has a very long history and it's gone through many chapters and evolutions over the decades. We are an artists and a visual arts organizations network that provides professional development mainly through residencies and workshops for artists. But we also work as a support system to each other. And with most of our partners being grassroots organizations or non-institutional spaces, that way of working together really makes a difference, not only intellectually, but also very much on a practical basis in terms of support. Mary Spirito, the far end here, is the founding director of Protocinema. I must say that probably is the person that we need to introduce the least, because also has been organizing the program of talks here. But you're here with the hat, with the Protocinema hat on, which is an itinerant arts organization realizing site-aware exhibitions in different spaces and places. Established in 2011, Protocinema produces context-specific projects of the highest quality that are accessible to everyone. Through its program, it evokes empathy towards understanding of difference across regions. And I think what is really special about what you're doing is that you say you're free from bricks and mortar. So as an itinerant organization, you don't have to pay the electricity bills and the heating bills and fix the toilets, perhaps, as we have to do. But I think what is also interesting in relation to these talks is Protocinema varies in its movements in space and time, I guess, to respond both to global concerns but also the changing conditions on the ground. Dana Whabira is an artist, which I think is also very important. A lot of these grassroots organizations are set up by artists, and is the founder of the Njelele Art Station in Harare in Zimbabwe. Njelele is an urban laboratory that focuses on contemporary, experimental and public art practices that intervene in the city itself. Dana trained as an architect. She went on to study art and design at Central St. Martin College in London, and amongst the many exhibitions and projects, she represented Zimbabwe at the 57th Venice Biennial, the last one, and is currently also in the Dakar Biennial and is doing a residency, which you could tell us a bit more. Last but not least, Fernanda Brenner, is a curator and writer based in Sao Paulo. In 2012, she opened Pivô, an independent non-for-profit space dedicated to contemporary art, which puts exhibitions and lectures and hosts artist residencies. It's housed in the iconic Oscar Niemeyer building, the Copain, and Pivô draws on the model of the European Kunsthalles and also the New York artist-run spaces. Fernanda has established one of Sao Paulo's most innovative art platforms as an alternative to the city's commercial galleries. And again, that's an interesting idea, thinking about what alternative spaces there are in the city, or the lack of them, and what your role is in relation to that. She's also curated and written extensively, including an exhibition called So Far So Good at White Cube in Sao Paulo, and Neither at Mendes Wood, and her writings appeared in Frieze, Art Review, and Exhibitionist, amongst many others. Now, local or global, before I pass the mic to my colleagues here, it's obviously a huge question, and it's difficult to think of where to approach it. For instance, we were talking earlier with my colleagues, and we were saying, what happens when the work travels? Does the work become international once it leaves the studio of the artist? Does it stay local? Is it the references of the artwork that makes it international, or what is it? Also, are we as people sitting in this audience, are we international? Are we local? Do we represent any of that? So we're not going to answer any of these questions. I think basically what I wanted to hint at is that it is such a wide question, and I think perhaps the best answer to it is to walk away with more questions, rather than for us here to be able to provide any answer, which will probably disappoint you. So going back to the theme again, I think we've already somehow answered the question simply by holding the conversation in this context, which is one of the most global art fairs, not just because it's its various manifestations, but also because it combines galleries and, of course, artists from pretty much around the world. With this in mind, I think the question is it global, is it local? It's probably both. And I think this is a place that sort of encapsulates that. Perhaps what is useful within this sort of context is to think of the fact that the international or the global looks different according to where you look at it from. And I think that this is the question that I would like to ask my colleagues here, and maybe we can start with you, Fernanda, because you're next to me. Like, from the perspective of your organization, for the thinking of Pivô, why is the international useful, and how do you feel that it connects with what you're doing at local level?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the opportunity of being here with these amazing people, talking about what I do in São Paulo. And I think Pivô has a very peculiar approach to like being both local and international, precisely because of what you speak. We are an institution that we are somehow a site-specific institution in a way that the entire institutional thinking of the project departed from this very crazy situation that a spot in São Paulo's most iconic building, as you said, the Oscar Niemeyer Koppen building. A 3,500 square meter space was abandoned in that venue for almost 20 years. So for me, this very fact shows a lot about how the city treats its heritage, architecture, really treats its history. And the entire institution is shaped after the fact of what can we do in a way to reclaim the space as something that is important for the city, and to give back it to the city in the terms of a functional art space. So it's a very long story on how this happened. So this is what I've been doing for the past 7 years, is still figuring out a way of making a sustainable model out of this massive space in a country that doesn't really support initiatives like that. So I think being a non-profit space in Brazil pretty much means you're a non-budget space. So there's no public support whatsoever, there's no cultural policies for it. And I'll speak quickly about how the scene that works, because I think it's important to answering the question. São Paulo is a wealthy city with a functional market, a big market, and few institutions, and even less focus on contemporary art. So there's pretty much nothing that stands in between the commercial aspects and the more established institutional practices of contemporary art. So there's no Kunsthalles, there's no very few residency programs, very few artist-run spaces. So for me, it's always surprising to understand in a city of 12 million people, how come there are so few art spaces. So I think besides the fact that we are taking over this venue, the idea is to create, I think more than a space, a situation where artists, we can provide a starting point for encounters in the art scenes, for the many agents of the art scenes to meet and to gather in a form of a space that is a place where art is actually made. So I think one of the greatest needs of São Paulo art scene, because as I tell you, is this 12 million people bubble that it's far from a lot of places, that has a lot of structural problems in terms of navigation. It's very hard to navigate the city. It's very hard to create meeting points for artists to meet. So I think one of the greatest necessities of the city is to create a consistent and ongoing international dialogue. So we've been making this mainly through the residency program, but also in the exhibition program. But I think, not to be speaking too much, but I think the biggest, the nicest way to do this is simply by putting artists together with a sense of hospitality. So the way we work, the way that the entire institution was built was pretty much bringing artists in and watching since day one. So the space, as I told you, was a ruin. So the very first movement we did was invite a group of artists to just sit there and figure out together with us what to do. So by doing that, we figure out in a very practical and physical way what were the actual needs of that specific artistic community, and how could we do something that was that would be meaningful not only for the art scene but for the city itself. But I think an important aspect is like by doing that we're also acknowledging the good points and the bad points about doing that, in terms of like being constantly self-critically aware of the impact a space of that can cause in a city. So I think until now I'm still figuring out this relationship between local and international. Like we don't have a program that is narratively reflects the most pressing needs of the city. You know, in terms of it's not a subject matter for exhibitions, but we really try to be actively engaged with the community we are grounded in terms of from attending community meetings to really trying to figure out how to create a situation where artists are provided with a creative space to not only to commission works or to make something happen, but also to really talk to each other and try to figure out what the potentials of this place in the city and also internationally. So.
It seems to me that there's an issue about also value. It's producing a cultural value, not necessarily a commercial value in relation to the commercial galleries that you say are populating the city. So you're almost kind of looking at the community, you're looking at how art filters through, and you're almost sort of like a platform for that.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is actually a question that I've been asking myself, and it's keeping me awake for a long time, you know. But I think the best thing we can do is find a way to commission works, you know. So because by working very closely to artists for a long time, I think this is the thing we can do that a commercial gallery can't, and the museum cannot either. So to find out how we can create an environment that I always say this, which is my utopia, having these 4 aspects, which is time, a decent budget, an interesting space, and also an important and ongoing exchange between many agents. So I think if you have this 4, I don't know if you
we'll try and make it our mantra.
If we share this, but I think this is our aim. We cannot only always provide everybody working at Pivô with all these aspects, but it's something I always try to do. And it's funny because doing the kind of work that we do, especially in a country with a failed infrastructure like Brazil, we are constantly trying to, but we are constantly facing decisions, like in terms of like to negotiate one of these aspects towards like productivity needs, or like sometimes patrons needs, and sometimes we don't have enough time to do the kind of exhibitions that we like to do. So the way I try to conceive the program is that we are very committed to a few things that are non-negotiable, and like a specific ethics that somehow I go back like every time to the very first, for the fundamental stone that make this this giant struggle, which is like keeping the space happening. So I don't know if I answered the question. Yeah.
Let's hear from the perspective of Njelele, but also from you as an artist, perhaps, Dana.
Well, I'd like to briefly speak about my current residency. Sorry. Can you hear it? I'm currently on residency in France, where I'm working on a project that involves our family home in Harare. It was built by a Swiss man, Hans Luckenbull, in the late 1940s to early 1950s, and who was inspired by Le Corbusier. And the place where I currently am on residency is a small village called Saint-Cyr-la-Poupie. And the building is called Maison Dora. And Pierre Dora was part of a group with Le Corbusier called Cercle et Carré, Circle and Square, along with Mondrian, Kandinsky, Arp. And what's quite interesting about the round house in Zimbabwe is that it derives from a circle and a square. So it's bringing urbanism in Zimbabwe into relation with a space in France. And this is indicative of the work that we do at Njelele, which reroutes the global through the urban imaginary of Harare. And I would say it forms a nodal point. It's just one of the ways the global is reimagined in Harare. The ICAC conference that you attended by the National Gallery of Zimbabwe is a different way. And it's part of a constellation of cultural and spatial practices informed by radical traditions such as music practices. And these include spaces like the Joyce Genje Makwenda Collection Archives, Village Unu, Zimbanete. There's also Fitan City in Bulawayo and Amagugu Heritage. And I'd say that we're part of a very, maybe almost you could visualize it as a web that engages with the local, that is always shifting and changing, and I believe that the two are inextricable, and you can see it through the work that Njelele and other spaces across Zimbabwe work.
Thank you. Mary, you sort of come from a different perspective in relation to the question of a global and local, because as was said in the introduction, you're not sort of held back from by bricks and mortar. So I wonder how your itinerant way of working is affecting perhaps or supporting your idea of international and global and local.
Okay, all right, sure, thanks. That's a nice question. Protocinema is itinerant. We're always making site-responsive exhibitions in different places, partly because I'd already, when I started Protocinema in 2011, I'd already been working in galleries for 20 years. So I'd already been in a situation where I was making exhibitions, getting to know the same space very well, and having the chance to work with artists repeatedly over time, which was very rewarding, but I was hoping to expand on that. And of course, I'm very inspired by existing models such as Art Angel in London, and also I myself became kind of itinerant. I was going back and forth between Istanbul and New York, and I wanted to travel more, and I also didn't want to pay rent all the time. I didn't want to have the obligations of running a building and the obligation of like show after show, without being able to have time to do the research and the thinking and maybe pausing, doing other things. So it was more like a response to what I wanted my life to be. And then also, around the time when I was thinking of starting Protocinema, I went around to artists and I said, in Istanbul, and said, if there was a new organization, what would you want? And most of them across the board said they want support to make their work, financial and emotional, intellectual, and they also want to see artists from elsewhere shown there, and they want opportunities to go abroad. So I think that in the way that we're talking about this, it's not enough to just do one or the other. I felt like it would make more sense to do both. So we can talk maybe more about that later. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to hear this in relation to, again, we were sort of preparing for this talk earlier, and we were talking about the issue of infrastructure and how the work that Mary is sort of doing is adding to an infrastructure that is perhaps already there, or finding new spaces, or sort of like activating perhaps spaces that are lying there, and then bringing the community with them. And I just want to tell us a little bit more about how you bring something in and kind of root it.
Well, also, I think maybe the reverse, right, where you have places and you're nurturing the context around the community around you, which, of course, for me, community is extremely important as well. But lots of times when I go other places, I'm working with other organizations on the ground that have networks, have support structures, and they're the ones that are kind of doing the translation for me. And I'm figuring out how to be the best possible guest.
Yeah.
So like where, lots of things come up, and we've had really great collaborations, such as like with Art Space in Sydney and Proyecto Emil in Lima. But it's one thing to bring people places, but it's also the one doing the visiting and bringing your whole organization is also kind of quite challenging. And I learn a lot about a culture when I go and work there more than when I go and visit there and just do studio visits and such. So it's been enormously eye-opening.
Now, going back to the question of the local and the global, I wonder whether, as small non-profit organizations, that of course we don't have the infrastructure that these sort of places have, or the big institutions have, whether you feel that you're having to make a choice, whether you need to be local, whether you need to be international, whether the choice is made for you by the organizations that you're trying, and the projects that you're trying to develop, or whether you're trying to address a need that you feel is something that is happening within your context. I'm thinking of this, for example, in relation to Gasworks being in London, which is certainly not an isolated space, but for us, the international is working internationally is a way of ensuring that we don't navel gaze and remain sort of completely obsessed with London being the beginning and end of everything. But it's also a way of addressing the community that makes up London. A lot of us are not British, a lot of us are international in that city, and actually, so the international is both something that happens outside, but it's also something that happens very locally to us. That's why, the question becomes really complicated when you start looking at the fabric that makes up the city. And I wonder how that happens in a place like Sao Paulo or Harare, for instance. Please, yes.
It's a very interesting aspect because I think we always, everybody working in the art field, especially nowadays, like the 2000s, constantly think it's a given that we have to work internationally. It's like we have this mindset, which is I'm constantly struggling to realize how far does it go, So this thing we were talking about before, how we think it's almost like a religious belief that we think places need an art scene. So I think I'm constantly thinking about this,
Totally disagree, yeah, but let's talk about it.
No, but it's something I wanted to share with you because it's not a certain at all, but it's something I wonder about because I think places need an art scene, but sometimes I do this mea culpa and thinking, especially working in Brazil, I think like São Paulo needs an art scene, but like if you go to some places in the north, they might not need. So I think it's interesting how you put it, like London is is this ambivalent situation regarding local and global, because it's a city that it's made by people from all over the world, and São Paulo is a city that it's very big, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's an international city. It's like the opposite of London. You know, like the city, like for example, the market is a good example, because there's like a lot of. It's a bit self-sustainable in so many levels, you know, in terms like a Brazilian artist, they get a representation in Brazil, they sell in Brazil. So it's like it's a continental country that has its own rules. So I think there's a lack of, there's like a great need for exchange still in the city in a very basic level, in terms like what we do with the residency, which is like bringing people in and also trying to send people out. So this is what we've been discussing through Triangle, for example, that to create, it's interesting what you say about being a good host, you know, because I think in the end it's a matter of hospitality, and like how can we work together in a more horizontal way, in terms of like we don't expect results out of what we do, in terms of like a kind of productive results or conclusions out of putting people together. So I think there's a lot of contradictions in what we do, and that's why I somehow brought these polemic questions, because I think it's about, to me, it's about inhabiting these contradictions and making things more complex, you know, because I think sometimes it's easy to wear the contemporary art hat and to somehow harmonize things through art, and things that don't necessarily talk. Like, so I think, I don't know, it's something I want to share with you, like how do you deal with the confluence, but also with the conflict of working internationally, which is something I'm constantly struggling to figure out. I think maybe more politically than artistically, you know, because I think, yeah.
What about you, Dana? How does the internationally look from the position of Harare, and how does it why do you feel there's a need for it, if there is a need for it?
Well, I've been thinking about, I guess, going back to one of your initial questions about what the international is, and if we consider ourselves international. And I was thinking about Njelele and how if one perspective could be that Njelele could be considered internationally orientated by virtue of the individuals, their thinking, and their activities. My view is that artists inhabit diverse cultures and move between worlds. So then would this reflect on the space? And I believe to some extent it does. We currently have a project for the African Mobilities exhibition in Munich, where we have a collaboration between myself, I live in Harare, there's Nolan Oswald Dennis, who's a South African artist who grew up in Zambia, who's currently based in the United States, and a South African art historian, Thembi Nkosi, who's based in Johannesburg. And the project is called Cartographic Entanglements, and it's a project that I would say cuts across the borders of nations and looks at ways that space is reconfigured through different scales of technologies, such as the radio, the railway, urban networks. And so it's interested in how ideas move, people move, and how these things all interacted within the space over time. We have another project. We had another project last year with Savvy Contemporary. It's their project. It was called That Around Which the Universe Revolves. And Harare was one chapter amongst 5 that included Berlin, Dusseldorf, Hamburg, and Lagos. And so artists, and I think it was a very multidisciplinary project, and dancers and various urbanists, and were engaged in a network of research, exchange, and artistic dialogues that interrogated their specific local urban epistemologies and histories and connected them with, all the different places across the world. We also worked in 2016 with Video Nomad, which is an itinerant video art screening platform. And it's run by Toby Aye, who's from Benin, and she's based in Berlin. And so it's been set up to work with video artists from Africa and the diaspora, and those who have ancestors from Africa in the past. And so that platform came to Zimbabwe and had, many of these artists there. So I think that these projects also form networks that Njelele can tap into, and also to some degree suspend, this, or shift the notions of what is local and what is global.
It's interesting because we're all sitting here. We're clearly from a privileged position of the fact that we can actually travel and we can go to all these places and we can be in touch with all of these artists and we can facilitate also these exchanges, which is quite remarkable. So I wondered whether perhaps I wanted to ask Mary something first, but whether we could talk a little bit about the impact that the international seems to have locally in terms of the audiences that you both have. But before we go to that, I wanted to ask Mary, how do you choose in your itinerant sort of travel where you go and why?
Okay, no problem.
I didn't write that question.
Yeah. In the beginning it was Istanbul and New York, because those were the cities I was living in. And then over time, I live primarily now in Istanbul, and I'm looking at neighbors, let's say, and Athens and Beirut and Istanbul as places to primarily do exhibitions. Once in a while, of course, I like to do things in New York still from time to time, and then once in a while pop out to somewhere else. And usually the decisions come based on relationships. So we can talk about community and relationships all day, but it comes from, meeting people and feeling comfortable and building trust. And then after that comes
It's interesting because if I think back of the Triangle Network, which is a big global infrastructure, that's how it was set up and that's how it continues. It's actually through personal relationships, through artists becoming interested, but also curators, of course, becoming interested in the idea of what the network can give them and the context in which they operate, and then feeling, okay, let's create a group here because I need to stay in touch. We need to stay in touch with each other in order to make my small projects that whose ambition is to not to expand, but to go deeper at local level. But in order to do that, I need the know-how, I need the expertise, I need the moral support, the friendship. Of course, I need the money too. And we need the money too, but yeah, exactly. So I think sometimes when we talk about infrastructure and when we talk about systems, we forget that actually artists, curators, and the way a lot of these things develop is actually by not so much but by a massive strategy, but it's passion and commitment and involvement and desire to make things happen. So let me go back to the question that I was asking just earlier, with that idea of commitment and feeling that you want to stay, because we were talking about all these travels. I wonder, have you thought about leaving and going somewhere where things are less tough, perhaps? But no. What is the point of staying there and actually making something and paying the electricity bill and fixing the toilet so that you're giving something to the wider community at local level? Maybe...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's an interesting. I think two things that we say here, especially Mari, about friendship is a word that I feel it was. Maybe myself, but I feel that it was like this. People are afraid of this word somehow, like to relate to, like to use this as an argument. Like maybe like that might sound nepotistic or something like that. But I really think, especially in spaces that are small spaces that rely a lot on personal esteem. I think this is very important, because we need to create this functional community that keeps us going, because there's a lot of obstacles. There's like constantly in a daily basis that say you should give up. No, that's enough. That's like I'm putting too much energy on this. So for me, like. The toilet part for Pivô is insane because, as I tell you, it was a ruin, a 35,000 square meter ruin in a building from the 60s. So you can imagine how it is to handle the maintenance of the space. I would say like a great percentage of my time goes towards like fixing that living being, which is the venue. And I think like a lot of decisions that we make at Pivô, they're part of this. A community that was born out of the adversity of the situation of like giving the space back to the city in form of a functional art space, whatever this means, And going back to the international part of it, I think there's a interesting story about Pivô. This thing I said before, that São Paulo sometimes might look like an international city, but it's not entirely. And when we started doing the project, this was 2011. I wasn't sure of what kind of audience we would get, because it was like this group of artists working together, like doing a kind of works that the regular art audience was not very used to. They were like more used to, because we work with projects that are context-oriented and site-specific installations, and projects that are really reacting to both the peculiarity of that architecture, but also the context of São Paulo downtown area. So it's a different way of putting exhibitions together that was a bit unprecedented in the local art scene. So I was very curious about the kind of reaction we would have. So we had this deliberate strategy that started by showing important Brazilian artists in a different way. So one of our first projects ever was an introduction of Mário Garcia Torres and Cildo Meirelles. And for me, this show, but
emerging artist, right? Emerging artist, right? Cildo Meirelles.
Yeah, established artists. I say emerging? No, okay.
I was being silly.
No, but I think it's like this specific project. I want to tell quickly about it because it really shows how the institutional thinking of Pivô is shaped in a global, local level. What we did as an institution was introduce Mário and Cildo. It wasn't a project. It was like this. We facilitate the encounter because we were like wanting to work with Mário, and we didn't have any money. This like the first year of the institution, so I think why not call them? So, like I had a friend that was very close to Mário, and that's all based on friendship. That Mexican friend that was working in São Paulo, and then we were talking to each other and say like, why not do a project with him? And like this was like right after Documenta, so he was like all over. And then she called him as a friend, and I called a friend of mine that knew Cildo, asking him to do the introduction. So we went to Mexico to talk to Mário, but like in a civilian way, like took a flight, 2 friends, to go to Mexico and sit with Mário and say like, what do you feel like doing in Brazil? And Mário, in the pub conversation, said to us that, oh, I really like Cildo's work. I'd love to meet him. And then we say, okay, now we have a project. So then we went to, I asked his friends to put me in touch with Cildo. Cildo had no idea who I was back then. And luckily, he welcomed us in the studio. And I said, Cildo, we went to Mexico. There's this super nice Mexican artist that want to meet you. And Cildo looked at me and said, okay, bring him over. So what we did as an institution was find a way to sponsor Mário's, like pretty much an airplane ticket to Rio. And we all went to Cildo's studio, like me, Alex Garcia, which was this friend, Mario and Sildo. So we spent the entire day in his studio talking with no idea that this was the biennial show. So it's like the most important date of the city, and we had no idea what to do. But we knew we had these two big names that would make people do faces like you just did, like, wow. Yeah. So it was a bit of a practical joke in a way, because it wasn't pretty much nothing in the show, no objects, nothing that would really stand as like a classical Mario or Sildo work. And all the works in the show were mentioned in conversations between them. So like it was a beautiful thing, because Sildo allowed Mario to re-edit one of his sound pieces. And Mario create this ongoing installation. It was mainly based on sound, because we couldn't pay insurance for Sildo's works, for sure. And I was very happy, because Sildo he has a crazy schedule, and he says something to me that really shaped the way. Like it's like there's this spark that orients Pivô's program today. And he said, like, you kids, you came here wanting to talk to Sildo, not Sildo Meirelles, this super famous artist. Like I love doing retrospectives. I love doing everything, but it's very rare that somebody approaches me like, not like do a new thing for us, like not as a label, but as an actual need to have a conversation. And also, I think an important aspect is this not knowing the outcome. So it was like the opposite of the kind of project we would feel like doing, to put this institution in the map, in the biennial, and this was like for me the way I like thinking about local and international, and what an institution can do. Like an institution the size of Pivô is this thing, like putting them in touch.
But I think there's something really important on the relationship, particularly in the conversation about scale of the institution and the flexibility of the institution. You could take risks that the bigger institutions can't take. And you can approach an artist also from a perspective that a big institution can't do.
Of course.
And I think that's actually a really interesting strategy on how you can then establish yourself and your own identity within the artistic ecosystem. But I know, I'm aware that time is running away. So, Dana, maybe if you could talk a little bit about, again, the relationship of the impact of the international at local level in relation to Njelele.
Sure. I think I'd like to take this opportunity to speak briefly about the Pachipamwe International Workshop. It was, It was started with the triangle.
Yes.
And it was initiated with triangle and took place between 1988 and 1994. And I believe it brought together over 100 artists who include Barry Bickle, Topfuma Gutsa, Rashid Jogi, Voti Tebe, who are Zimbabwean artists and also have represented Zimbabwe at the Venice Biennale. Who have gone on to represent Zimbabwe at the Venice Biennale, I should say. And also David Kolowane and the late Bill Ainsley participated, and they were two of the founders of the various founders of Triangle Workshop.
Within the continent, yeah.
And so, there were many other international artists, and I believe Chris Ofili was one of them.
I was going to mention, actually, Chris Ofili was at one of the... So the Pachipamwe workshops are a 2-week sort of like a summer camp for artists for 2 weeks, where artists are brought together, and for 2 weeks they make work, and at the end of it, the work goes possibly in the bin. So the idea of value is on the experience and on building that community rather than on the product. But that's where sort of ideas come and experimentations happen. And Chris, actually, during his trip to Zimbabwe, he'd never been before, started using elephant dung.
Yes.
So what has now become such a signature work started in a place and in a context that was completely sort of free, and actually done what was around, because I mean they actually the workshop happened outside the city in a farm somewhere completely wild. So again, not just ideas are coming together, but what could become art material. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. You stole. Yeah. Well, you've really touched on, I think, what I wanted to emphasize. The possibilities of these workshops and what the international means within them. And I think I also wanted to emphasize the importance of Pachipamwe and in terms of the framework for international dialogue and exchange, and also that Njelele humbly follows in the footsteps of this critical initiative. So that's over, 20 years now. And so now I'd say that Njelele is just one of the nodes in the Triangle Network. And it's able to offer a diverse engagement as a non-institutional institution. And the interesting thing is that Pachipamwe means to come together. And this is very important at Njelele. It's a place or a space that really works towards creating this meeting point and a convivial space that I would say brings together a community of artists and practitioners where informality is the form. And yeah, that's where I'll stop.
And Mary, in relation to this, and time maybe quickly, what sort of response do you get from the people at local level when you come in and you bring the international work, or you work with local artists to produce something in all these different places? What sort of, in terms of attendance, in terms of events that you put together, how do you see the response?
It varies quite a bit. Since I'm in Turkey so much, there is a regular audience there for when I show artists from elsewhere there, but then when I bring artists from there to other places. When I work with the people that I have relationships with in those cities, we're meeting their network, and then we're also doing studio visits, and the idea is to build long-term relationships to bring some of those artists back to Turkey. So it's a very long-term engagement. We're thinking about the big picture, and it's a slow,
But it builds that sort of
kind of exciting dialogue,
network of friendships and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm aware we have just under 10 or about 10 minutes left. So do we have any questions from the public, or if you also have a question for each other here in the panel, please feel free to do that.
Well, I was thinking about this whole thing of the global and the local as far as the balance between how much to go out and have dialogue with people outside, how much to stay in and have dialogue with people inside, and how to balance it, because I think it's one of those things that's always tipsy-turvy. We don't want too much of one or the other. How do you keep it in balance?
To think. I'd say that I think we've managed to find a balance so far. I would.
What's your balance?
I think I'd say that, of course, there are limitations, do with infrastructure and resources. So we can't do everything we would like to. We haven't been able to work with particular individuals or organizations that we've wanted to. But at the same time, I think it gives an opportunity to self-organize and make things happen, I think
Fernanda, do you have a quick answer to that as well? Because I know we have a question.
Yeah.
How do you balance it?
It's interesting, this question, because I think I'm constantly trying to find this balance. And I think I told the story about Mario and Silda, and I realized that I didn't conclude because I was talking about the audience. So I think why having an international artist, the way Mario was presented to the local art scene was very interesting in that point, because Silda was the one that already, like, everybody knows him, but they went there to get to know a different version of an artist that really know, and be like he, like, of course us, we provide the encounter, but somehow Silda was the host of this Mexican artist coming in, but we're doing a show out of it, so it's a different it's a different kind of dialogue. So I think that experience shaped exactly this pursued balance that we have, not like bringing aliens in without context or sending people out without the safety network, which is sometimes, if you don't have enough time or enough, commitment or the emotional shelter that we've been talking about, things can be left open, So I think maybe it's that the balance is this, like guests and hosts.
Doesn't it also go back to our initial question that they inhabit each other?
Yeah. They inhabit each other. That's really nice.
That's true, yeah.
There's a question, yes.
Yeah, I have a quick question, actually. I would like to pick up on the idea of a balance. In the context of the global south, the emergence of, let's say, global and local is partly due to the cultural void from the government. Like in the 60s and 70s, a lot of this government, maybe to promote the political agenda, supported art, and then gradually it faded, which empowered artists. What I wanted to find out from you guys, right now in that dialogue relationship between, like, let's say, local and global, what is the position of the government? Is it a hindrance, or they could become a partner?
Do you want to start, Dana?
Sure. Our government is very supportive. They support the Zimbabwean pavilion at the Venice Biennale. I think within Zimbabwe itself, it's not been an easy moment, so we don't have access to government funding. But I would hasten to say that by virtue of the individuals themselves and the projects and the work that they produce, that there's the local and the global, in my view, are sort of elastic. They, if I think about all of the Zimbabwean artists who are not based in Zimbabwe, they're based in the diaspora, and then we have artists who are mobile, who travel. I then think that the question of what is international and what is local really breaks down at a certain point.
What about you, Fernanda? Maybe thinking of the relationship. What is the relationship of the government and impact or not on what you're producing?
Well, nowadays the government in Brazil is a mess. So I think I'm better say the thing is like an important thing to say about Pivô. I was telling briefly the story is that we opened in a very, very specific moment in Brazil, which was 2010. So I don't know if you remember, it was like the time when the price was going up in The Economist. So, and Europe was right after 2008. So there was like this fiction that Brazil was like the next thing, the country of the future. So I think a lot of people, government or like real estate developers and you name it, were somehow taking advantage of this situation through contemporary art. So I think this is both interesting and terrifying in the same proportion, because for us, for example, I think if I did exactly the same movement I did in 2010 now, it wouldn't be possible. Because I think the city was in a very specific mood that was very sympathetic with this kind of DIY methodology of like kids taking over abandoned space, which is something that happened all over, you know, like Berlin, New York, and London. So all of a sudden there was like this examples of neighborhoods like Kreuzberg or Williamsburg that through art became nice. So that's nice. That's why I'm skeptical, you know, because back then the government was looking to art somehow as a creative economy tool, which I'm very skeptical about. So Pivô, since the very beginning, I tried to make a very clean cut between art and creative economy, like somehow. So art was not instrumentalized as a tool for creating a nicer spot out of a decadent space.
We're neither propaganda nor gentrification.
Yes,
so.
but this was then. But now I think the situation is so complex that it became this very arid situation that art is their very last concern. So the funding that were non-existent back then, now it's like even worse. So let's see.
I think we need to end, I'm afraid. I mean, I just wanted to add one thing. I mean, Gasworks is certainly not in the global south, but for example, with what's going on now in the government in the UK, with Brexit being always in our face, I feel that what Gasworks was doing in the 90s as an interesting thing is almost radical, bringing in more foreigners into the UK. Yeah. So it's globally, things are shifting every day, and I think the relationship between the global and the local needs to be revised literally at such a massive scale, and we can all do it in our own little way from our own little place. Yeah. But I think we're all very much agents of that. We have to stop. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel and for you all to come. Thank you.